So today, like I said, is one of our fun days. We're going to give it an intro because I don't think we've done it since we've opened our new YouTube channel, and we get quite a few people watching YouTube. So when there's 5 Sundays in a month, we do a couple of different special things. Sometimes we do a big question Sunday in which I try to answer questions that anybody can ask. If you happen to be watching on YouTube and you want to send in a question, please do. I'll do my best to answer it for you. But one of the ones that everybody seems to really enjoy is what we're doing today, which is called 5-minute messages. We have some amazing speakers in our churches, and I throw out a scripture to a whole bunch of different people, and whoever wants to volunteers to give their take on these scriptures. And despite what they say, I don't try to make it hard on them. Although they may try and tell you differently. But it's wonderful because they really dig in and they help us to learn too. So we're going to start out with Mary.
Well, yes, it was difficult. I was told at Sand Lake that Beth is the serious speaker, I'm the humorous speaker, and then there's Daryl.
So, I know who said that.
I'm not going to say. So, yes, Daryl sends out a Bible verse, and we look at it and think we're going to figure out something to say. This one he sent out about, I'd say 5 or 6 weeks ago. And I swear what he did was open the Bible, put his finger on a verse. And I read it and I thought, wow, where do you even, it made no sense whatsoever. And so I stewed on it for about a month, ran it through my head, where I wanted to go, got ideas. And I thought to myself, I need to sit and read Joshua, because I needed some background on this. What was the slavery? How did they get where they were going? There were lots of questions there. And I'm going to say, you could probably, I don't know how many Daryl would say, but I'd say there's at least 3 to 4 full-length sermons that you could do out of this verse. So for me, you're getting the Reader's Digest version. And it probably is less than 5 minutes. That's why I'm babbling, because I'm trying to use up a minute or 2. Because otherwise he prattles at the end. So, here we go.
I'm going to do it anyway.
This was the first Passover the Israelites celebrated in their homeland, the Promised Land. They ate unleavened bread and roasted grain. So why did God stop sending manna? Well, his people were now where they should be, in the Promised Land, with its milk and honey and grain and crops and anything else that they're going to be able to grow. They were done wandering. They were home. They wandered in that desert for 40 years, and they weren't being very good people in that 40 years. And at this point now, they're being blessed by God. They could be self-sufficient, and they were being obedient. Most of our ancestors have traveled here from Europe, Asia, other countries, continents. And to them, where we are now, was the Promised Land. Maybe they came because they were being persecuted for their religion. Maybe they came because politics were not to their liking. Maybe they just wanted to start a new life. And that's just what the Israels wanted, was a new land and a new life. When the Lord told Joshua he rolled away the shame of slavery in the Bible verse that says reproach, he was probably speaking of not being circumcised. This group meandered around in the wilderness for decades, long decades. And those men that had been circumcised were now long dead. The younger guys were not. When the Lord asked that the men be circumcised before being allowed in the Promised Land, he was asking for obedience from them. Now, I read Joshua, so I all the lands they conquered and how they did it, and And then I had to go to Deuteronomy, because now I gotta figure out what the heck God was doing with Abraham way back when. See, Daryl didn't make this easy. I don't care what he says. So, God had made a covenant with Abraham, and the signing of that was with circumcision. And what the circumcision meant was the releasing of sin. We've all been circumcised, not physically. And in Colossians 2, verses 11 and 12, this is how they put it. When you came to Christ, you were circumcised, but not by a physical procedure. It was a spiritual procedure, the cutting away of your sinful nature. For you were buried with Christ when you were baptized, and with him you were raised to a new life because you trusted the mighty power of God who raised Christ from the dead. And I was told in Sand Lake I was probably the only one that would speak on circumcision, being a nurse. We've been promised a promised land in our future. Someday we're going to stop wandering in that desert. We're going to have to cross that river. And we need to be circumcised. And when we get there, no more pain, no more worries, no more tears, none of that. We will have joy. We will have peace. All the Lord asks is that we be obedient and love him and trust him with all our heart.
Good job.
And now comes the serious one.
Okay, and it was a difficult passage because you had to do some research. You had to look at not just Joshua, but Numbers and Deuteronomy and Exodus and trying to get your facts straight. And I had a lot of help during praise practice because Daryl and Heather are there, so I had a few questions for them, and they set me straight on a few things. And even at Sand Lake, I got set straight on the circumcision. I thought it was after they crossed the Jordan, but it wasn't. It was prior to crossing the Jordan. So here it goes. The fugitive slaves of Egypt crossed out of the desert and into the promised land. Once in the promised land, actually they were circumcised and then crossed over to the promised land. They then celebrated the Passover. After that, they conquered the land of the Canaanites and settled there. The end. Just kidding. As Paul Harvey would say, now for the rest of the story. Exodus 6:7 says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. The Israelites went into the desert following their leader Moses on God's command. Picture yourself as one of those oppressed slaves of Egypt. How do you think they felt? Yes, they were leaving bondage and slavery, but going out into a desert? The unknown? You know, there wasn't just a few of them, there were thousands of them. The thought of freedom exciting, but the fear of leaving the only thing they have ever known their whole life, very scary. I'm sure you guys have felt that way about other things too. The totally unsure, scary feeling of the unknown. How do you think you would feel? Is there any part of your life that you've been scared like that? How about getting married? How about starting a new job? Or even the unknown of raising a family? And these people going out into a desert with so many people and not very many provisions, they just needed to trust God. In the desert, the Israelites had a terrible time trusting God. Time after time, they questioned his leadership. They whined and they cried out in fear. And when God showed them miracles, they humbled themselves. When the tests and hardships of the desert life became difficult, they became angry and resentful. They forgot God's power and feared their unknown future. And in so doing, they lost their privilege to enter the land of the promise. How frustrated God must have been with them. They just didn't have faith. They didn't have faith in God. They didn't trust him enough. They didn't let go of their own control. So they wandered for 40 years until a new generation of people grew up from the ones that entered the desert in the beginning. You know, there was only 2 people who made the journey from start to finish. Only 2 faithful men, Joshua and Caleb. Not even Moses was able to cross the Jordan into that promised land. Why not Moses? Well, I'll let you look that up because it's a long story too, and I don't have but 5 minutes. Why not Moses, their leader? Because even Moses, human as he was, made a big mistake, and God punished him for it by not allowing him to reach the promised land. In the Bible, it states that Moses died on Mount Nebo, a place that was within sight of the promised land. So this makes me feel, it's my own opinion, but it makes me feel that even though Moses did a very big wrong, God had compassion for him and still let him see the promised land. To me, that's an amazing kindness. Now we get to the part of Joshua chapter 5, where the Israelites crossed the Jordan into the promised land. In this chapter, God redeems the people from their past. Verse 9 says, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." The Jordan River was the last boundary between the wilderness and the land God had promised them. It was the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise to Israel. After crossing the Jordan with the new generation of people, that enabled them to partake of the Passover celebration, and the land still had to be taken over from the Canaanites so they could settle there. They were also now able to eat from the fruits of the land and no longer needed manna that God provided for them in the desert. In Deuteronomy, see, it goes back to Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Numbers. In Deuteronomy 8:2, he, being Moses, declares, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." So I can't help but think, wouldn't it have been so much easier for the Israelites if they just gave themselves to God and followed his commandments? All of this wandering wouldn't have to happen, but it did. It did happen, and they all had to go through it to teach them obedience and to teach them trust. Just like today, there are so many who are stuck in their own rotten lives and are pretty depressed and sad because they don't want to trust God. They're going to do it themselves. God says, "Trust me," but no, they just can't let go of that control. So what does God do? He lets them live their life on their own, in their own sad desert. Change only happens through trust. When you trust God wholly, you change. You can't change if you keep going back to the desert. So how do you feel when you stand on the edge of reaching for a long-awaited goal? Are you happy, sad, or relieved that the journey's nearly over? Are you scared of the tests and the trials that still lie ahead, or do you view your future with courage and faith? So in a nutshell, the bottom line, 1, God gives us promises. Trust him. 2, believe in God and grow your faith daily. 3, follow God. Have courage and just do it.
So I'm basically just gonna read this word for word because I did not write this, the kids did. I was basically just playing secretary. So I want to make sure you guys hear everything that they said. Remembering is an important way for us to learn from others. This story takes place in a place that was a memorial. Before they camped there, the tribes of Israel put up stones to tell people in the future that God had stopped the Jordan River for them so that they could cross over into the promised land. And also that he had done the same thing for them at the Red Sea so that they could escape the Egyptians. One of the meanings of the word Gilgal is circle, which is like circling back to something that has happened before. When God's people got there, they wanted to do what their ancestors had done to show that they followed God. They were remembering the promise that God had made to Abraham before they had even gone to Egypt, that he would take care of all of his people. God's people knew that he had taken care of them in Egypt and in the desert. They were punished by wandering in the desert, but even when those who came out of Egypt complained about their food and disobeyed God by making an idol, they knew that he still took care of them, even after telling them that they would no longer be able to go to the promised land. Just like the Israelites remembered the promises that were made between God and Abraham, God also remembered that he promised to be with his people. God provided whatever his people needed, wherever they needed it and whenever they needed it. He made sure that they were taken care of after they got to Canaan. God made sure that they had a good leader to take them into the promised land. Joshua was a good leader because he trusted God and had not complained about what it was like in the desert. Joshua knew that God's plan was better than them giving up and going back to Egypt to be slaves again. Once those who did not trust God were gone, Joshua and the Israelites knew that they would win against their enemies because they trusted the promise that God had given them that they would be able to have the promised land. Before they went to the promised land, the Israelites celebrated the Passover to remember what God had done for them in Egypt. God had sent the plagues so that the Israelites could leave Egypt and go to the place that he had promised them. The Passover was another day that reminded them that God had protected his people, those who trusted him, because the people who listened to God and put the lamb's blood on their doors were passed over by the angel of death, and those who did not believe God's promises had died. Then after the Passover, the people were able to eat the food in the promised land because God had made sure that they were able to find enough food there. They didn't need the manna anymore because God had given them the food that he had promised all the way back with Abraham, that would be there for them when they got there. When we remember that God keeps his promises, we can remember that we can trust his plan no matter what.
I gotta tell you, when I listened to these three messages over to Sand Lake, I just had all sorts of emotion. I'm not an emotional person, but they were amazing, weren't they? Just deep and just wonderfully written. You know, they say it was difficult. Well, I got a story for you. I received my license to preach in November of 2007. In December 1st of 2007, I was given my first appointment, which was to these two churches. And I think in May of 2008, I got a phone call. Hey, we'd like you and a few other pastors to give a short message at a clergy gathering. Never been clergy before. I've only been clergy for, 6 months. And I'd never been to a clergy gathering, so I didn't know what it was. I found out later, and by the way, Mary, I had 2 weeks. And they gave me the scripture. And when I got there, I discovered that a clergy gathering was exactly what it sounds like. Gathering of clergy from the entire state. There were over 800 pastors, the bishop, and 9 district superintendents. I don't know if you've ever had to speak in front of a room full of pastors, especially when you've only been one for 6 months, but I was nervous. But I got the comfort that I needed, and I got the inspiration that I needed from this verse. And I'm just going to give you a couple little short insights into that. The Israelites had Passover in Egypt. They painted the posts of their door with lamb's blood. The spirit of death passed over their house. They experienced it and lived through it. And God said, remember this, so you never forget that I protected you and brought you out of slavery. So a year later, base of Mount Sinai, they celebrated for the first time the festival of Passover. Then they entered the desert. Now, if you've never been to the Seder, I'll tell you there are specific foods that we have that remind us of the miracles of God and all the reasons we celebrate Passover, and you don't find those in the desert. So it was 38 years later, when Joshua and the people entered the Promised Land, that they celebrated for the second time the festival of Passover. Okay, so it's been 38 years since they did it. Now, when they came into the Promised Land, what was the first obstacle they hit? Jericho. Jericho was a mighty city, and they took it down. Actually, God took it down. The Amorites, also known as the Canaanites, saw this. You want to know something? When you see your biggest bully on the block taken down like he's nothing, you get nervous. And when the people stopped on the plains of Jericho and celebrated Passover, they were being faithful to God's commands. As Beth said, and Mary said, and Heather said, these commands go back all the way back to the beginning, the Levitical laws. Then they came to the Exodus. And then in Deuteronomy means second. So Moses, for the second time, repeated the laws so they wouldn't forget just before they went into the Promised Land. So now they are celebrating Passover on the plains of Jericho, being faithful to God's commands. Now, have you ever had to do something that you were really nervous about? You knew something bad was probably coming, but you had to wait? Think about the Canaanites. They just saw what happened to Jericho, the mightiest city in Canaan. And they know they're next. And they're waiting for it. But instead of having it happen right away, these Israelites park on in the plains and celebrate. So all the time they're celebrating, their enemies are getting more and more nervous, having to wait. Because they were faithful to God, God was faithful to them. And when they did attack, they took them out pretty quickly. But the telling line in this whole scripture is the last one. After they ate from the produce of the Promised Land, God stopped the manna. He didn't do it when they got in. He didn't do it when they celebrated Passover. He didn't stop it when they ate from the land for the first time. He did it the day after. If we're faithful to God, God's abundance is more than what we need. God doesn't give us abundance, He gives us overabundance. It's always more than we need. When we're faithful, so is He. Thank you, everybody who spoke. That was amazing.